In this series, lowimpact.org talks with people working to build a mutually owned, democratic, decentralised economy that builds community and doesn't destroy nature. We want to increase collaboration to bring about system change. Find links to the sites mentioned in the videos in the description below. Join the conversation by liking, commenting and subscribing to our channel.
So this is the second in a series of interviews that will accompany a book I'm writing that will be published by Chelsea Green, and they're an employee-owned company and part of the new economy that the book is describing, built around a mutual credit core. I'll put links to everything we talk about in the description, and today I'm talking with Matthew Slater. He wrote the Credit Commons white paper. That's an idea for federating mutual credit networks to create a new global moneyless trading system. He's part of a group called Mutual Credit Services, which has been formed to build this federation. Hi, Matthew.
Afternoon.
So your Credit Commons idea was one of the things that first turned me on to mutual credit. And we've been talking about mutual credit on low impact for a while now. Our position is that humanity is on a very destructive path, which will be impossible to get off as long as we have this money system. I'd like to ask you some questions about the Credit Commons idea, but I also want to make sure that the answers make sense to complete beginners. So if your answers are a bit too complicated, I want to try and break them down and simplify them. First question, why are you doing this? I mean, you have a huge knowledge of the finance sector and of money, and you're a coder and you're very clever. You could have got a job in the city and made loads of money. Why did you do this instead?
I never fitted very well into the institutional contexts, and the few times I tried to have a proper job, it didn't make me happy and it didn't really work out very well. So it was very easy for me to decide to commit my life to do something more meaningful. That's the other thing about proper jobs. They're rarely meaningful in any sense that I would understand.
Yeah.
And so the reason why I got into alternative money systems, complementary currencies, was because certainly 12 years ago, hardly anybody else seemed to be doing it. There wasn't any decent software around, and it looked like a nice little niche that I could make my own, which I have done.
Okay, and what is it that you're doing exactly? And remember, for non-technical, completely beginners.
Well, my responsibility for much of the last 12 years has been to build and run and maintain software for a large number of French-speaking complementary currencies. So Let's and a few time banks, very local projects, most of them fairly small, like less than 100 people. And so I'm maintaining 300 plus instances of my software for them. That takes up a fair bit of time. But I've had more and more time to myself, and I've been able to devote it to working out how all of those separate systems could exchange with each other while maintaining their own sovereignty and independence, which tends to be quite important to those groups. And so they do that not by issuing a new currency, but by keeping a record of how much each group owes each other group. And that's what the Credit Commons protocol is about.
Okay, and how successful have you been? Does it work?
Well, I've built a reference implementation of the Credit Commons protocol, and that works.
What does that mean?
It's going to take reference implementation is when you define the language, but then you have to write some software to speak the language. And so the way we do a lot of things now in the world of the internet is to define the language or the protocol first. The thing that connects everything together is more important than the actual software.
Okay, so does all this allow different groups to trade with each other? Does it work?
Well, I haven't implemented it yet for all those groups that I'm supporting. So it works in tests and it works for mutual credit services, but it's going to take a bit more plugging in and rewiring to get all those groups talking to each other. And then, of course, to encourage other groups that don't run my software to plug into that as well.
So I interviewed Dill recently, and Mutual Credit Services, they're helping to build mutual credit clubs We're talking to various groups who might build a little trading club. How does that relate to what you're doing? How does it dovetail?
A mutual credit club is a group of people keeping accounts using mutual credit, and I've written the reference implementation is the software for that. So they have built an app so that the members of the mutual credit club's team can keep accounts between each other, particularly to remember how much time they've given. And they're using my ledger software, my reference implementation for that. And so the hope of the project is that they will encourage many more groups to practice in this way.
So as I understand it, Mutual Credit Services have produced the sort of the front end that people use to trade in their groups, and you've produced the sort of underlying back end which allows each group to trade with other groups. Is that right?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So could other types of alternative exchange system be part of the Credit Commons too, or would they be in competition?
It depends what level you mean. Any group using any kind of currency could exchange with any other group using any other kind of currency, as long as the relationship between them is a mutual credit relationship, because that's what the protocol defines. So it doesn't matter if you're a time bank or a transition currency or a LETS or a cryptocurrency. You can trade with other groups of different types using the Credit Commons protocol, as long as you can define and agree an exchange rate.
So it would work with existing mutual credit systems, existing LETS systems, existing cryptocurrencies, and existing time banks.
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
Although there's plenty of competition for exchanges, which is to say systems that help different currencies to trade with each other.
Right.
There
Okay.
are other ideas out there.
That was what I was going to ask. Give me an example of some of those other ideas.
Well, the closest competitor is Ripple, or what I call mesh credit. And there are several ideas about how best to do that. A popular one at the moment is called trust lines. That works on the Ethereum blockchain. And it can work between individuals or it can work between groups. It just says that you have a load of accounts and they define explicitly how much they trust each other.
So that particular system, the Ripple system, that wouldn't dovetail with the Credit Commons.
It would fit into the Credit Commons, but it could also, depending how you use it, what level you use it on, it could compete with the Credit Commons as well.
Right.
Because you don't want to have different infrastructures trying to do the same thing at the same level. That's wasteful.
Why have you hitched your wagon to the Credit Commons approach? Why do you think if there's competition, why do you think that one's going to win?
Well, I've identified a problem with the scalability of mesh credit, which is quite important in my view, looking at world history, which is that in a mesh credit system, there's no way to get back to balance. If you have a lot of trade in one direction more than the other direction, you build up a debt. And in mesh credit, there are no groups that can negotiate with each other to manage the debt. There's just a whole load of individuals.
Right. So it's just a mesh of individuals. It's not arranged into groups. Okay.
Yes. And that's why the Credit Commons is a tree in opposition to this idea of the mesh, because a tree has, it's a bit more structured and you can always go down the tree to have something in common with somebody else.
And where have you got to? What else needs to be done? And could you do with some help, and what kind of help?
Well, there's a lot of software needs writing. A lot of that is augmenting software that I've written already. But then I guess what is really lacking at the moment is all the other kinds of complementary currencies, particularly other LETS and time banks networks, coming to join in. So a lot of them don't have budgets at all. a lot of the complementary currency software is run completely by volunteers. So they don't have a lot of capacity to do new and interesting things. And if they do, very often they ask their users, and the users just want shallower features. So I've been talking to those groups for a long time, and there are many, many other groups that I know less about and have less contact with, and reaching out to them to say, look, this is strategically valuable that we can join all of these systems together. You can't compete with the global economic system if you can only trade with a few of your friends.
Right, so you could do with some help from some coders, people with coding skills, but also you could do with some help from people who just want to help and they don't necessarily have coding skills.
Well, Mutual Credit Services is, of course, helping a lot because they're building a business around the idea. And they're also finding new use cases and accessing networks that I'm not close to at all.
Yeah.
So people who want to contribute could just as easily go through them as come to me directly.
Yeah. So if clubs federate to the national level, the credit units could be sort of valued in the national currency for ease of understanding. If it grows to cover the world, will the units still be priced in national currencies? And if so, there's got to be exchange rates between the currencies. How will that be taken into consideration? And could the credit units be valued in dollars, for example, in the global system, because it's the global reserve currency for the time being, at least?
So if we talk about it covering the world, let's assume that all other things are equal and that national currencies continue very much as they do today. And so it's possible in the Credit Commons to set an exchange rate between any two countries' currencies, but you might not want to keep it updated every nanosecond. That would be against the spirit of the thing. The reason that you have nanosecond trades is mostly for purposes of speculation.
Yeah.
And to allow people to make tiny, tiny margins.
But it would all be automated.
Well, we try to automate as much as possible, yes.
Right, okay.
I'm not sure what you mean. The exchange rates would be automated.
Yeah.
They could be, but they would be automated according to an agreed algorithm.
Right.
That's the important thing. The exchange rates are ultimately negotiated. They are not like the crest of a wave on a market that just happens.
Right. Okay. I don't know how you would do that, but I trust you that it can be done. Could there be some sort of currency speculation in the Credit Commons? I'm guessing it might not be worth it with sort of accounts, positive and negative limits.
No, insofar as there is any exchange rate variation, you could have currency speculation. And in practice, there would be a need to change exchange rates because groups are not always going to get the right level or the economies might change. And that's a very important way to help restore and maintain the balance of trade. But we would keep exchange rate variations to a minimum.
Yeah, I mean, because national currencies might collapse, might they? Or there might be hyperinflation in a particular country. So in time, will the unit of exchange be standard across the world rather than based on national currencies?
Well, that's a political question that I couldn't answer. It depends on the evolution of things.
Right.
It's certainly a possibility. There are great injustices in having different exchange rates.
Yeah.
But there are also great benefits as well in terms of allowing things to adjust and find their own level. So it's a difficult question.
Here's another difficult question. So at the moment, so a haircut, for example, costs more in London than it does in Nairobi, for example. But if someone got a certain amount of credit for cutting someone's hair in Nairobi and then they travel to London, would they be able to use those credits to get a haircut in London?
Well, that depends on the exchange rates. I'm not here to set the exchange rates. In in the nearest system that exists to the Credit Commons, which is called Community Exchange Systems, maybe you've referenced that elsewhere, CES, they have a system of exchange rates which takes that into account, time and the living wage. And
Right,
so in that
okay.
system, you should be able to translate a haircut from one country to another.
Right, so that's doable, yeah, okay. What's the end game? Is it the end of money? Would you like the Credit Commons to sit alongside the banking and money system, or to replace it?
I'm only capable of seeing the next step. I mean, I can imagine, in my spare time, numerous end games. I imagine there's a role for the money as we know it in the future economy, but at the same time, I would hope that it was very much better governed and that there were other kinds of money. Maybe the end game really is a plurality of money. One approach is to say that money should be a market where people can choose to use whichever kinds of money they use, and therefore they will choose the best. And so you have this idea of monies competing with each other. That's what Friedrich Hayek was talking about, and a lot of the cryptocurrency people think of that as some kind of ideal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess as the Credit Commons gets bigger, at some point tax is going to have to be payable in mutual credit. How likely do you think that will be? Can we get states on board?
Well, complementary currencies historically have been able to engage with local governments, but only in a very limited way. And so it would take some changes in the shape of the world, I guess, for governments to take an interest. And also a lot more volume would have to be going through mutual credit systems and the Credit Commons. But it's certainly possible. But the main thing is that the governments would have to bear in mind when they collect this tax would be that it's designed to be spent locally, which is, of course, what's happening in, is it Lancaster?
Don't know.
Where's that model where they have the Preston model?
The Preston model, yeah.
It's all about spending the taxes, local taxes on local businesses.
Yeah.
So it's a very good principle, but most local governments don't do that at the moment.
Yeah, we're talking to Kless, who sort of take the Preston model idea around local authorities. So that's quite exciting. So who will own the Credit Commons? How will it be governed?
Well, the whole point is that it's owned by the people that use it, and more specifically, it's owned by each group that defines itself. So these groups are all plugging into each other. Nothing is owned by anybody who isn't participating.
If it becomes a global system, how will it be governed?
Well, since it's all about how people and groups trade with each other, it will be governed by the people and groups. Maybe that sounds naive. Maybe there's always power interests that come in and swoop over the top. But there isn't really a need for them at the moment. And there's always a way to escape, because in the Credit Commons, you can just go off and define yourself another group and plug in somewhere else if you don't like the governance of the group you happen to be in. So that's my hope. There's always ways to subvert power, though. So you have to be constantly vigilant.
It's sort of a bit like the internet. You can build yourself a website and get it online, and you're away.
Yes, a bit like that. Although bear in mind that the internet, as the Credit Commons would, depends on physical hardware that is very difficult to own.
Very difficult to own because it's distributed.
No, because it's expensive to
right.
lay. It requires highly specialist maintenance, and it's all in the hands of the few big companies, as it should be, because it's core infrastructure. So with the Credit Commons, you've got that core infrastructure, the fiber optics and the servers and things, which you cannot control. But in terms of the monetary system, there isn't any core infrastructure. There's only the protocol, and everyone has their own bit of software, which talks that language defined by the protocol.
So I'll try this one more time. There's no need for any sort of global governance.
You kind of need a top level
Yeah.
global governance.
Yeah.
We call that the root node. But that's just, let's say it's organized geographically by the continents, and all the continents need to trade with each other. So they get together and they agree an exchange rate system. That's the global governance.
Okay. Okay.
It's very light.
So since the creation of mutual credit services, do you think the credit commons has become more likely? And has it meant that your strategy has changed?
Well, it's good to have someone other than just me encouraging it to happen. I think that makes it much more likely. Mutual Credit Services has some great people in it with, different networks and different ideas to me.
Yeah,
and I'm thrilled just to see it all going on in parallel to what I'm doing.
Yeah. Are we going to be able to get all this in place before ecological and societal collapse?
Can you say that again? You dropped off.
Are we going to be able to get all this in place before ecological and societal collapse?
Well, it depends when it happens, isn't it? It seems unlikely.
Yeah.
But anything that we can get in place will certainly help.
I asked this next question to Dill. I think you might have another perspective. Would a credit commons, a mutual credit economy, have to grow forever? Does it have this growth imperative like the current economy?
No, not at all.
It doesn't. It could be stabilized, so we can live without destroying nature.
The size of a mutual credit economy is however much trade people want to do. There isn't anything in it which says there should be more trade, or more trade is better, or more trade is more efficient, for example.
And no interest.
Interest in itself isn't really, it doesn't drive growth, but there could be interest. Not at the moment, though. Not while it's just for trade and exchange.
Right. Okay. That sounds like it's another conversation, a bigger one. So if it works, if it really starts to take off, it's going to reduce the need for banks. Do you think they'll fight back? And how might they do that? And what might we do about it?
Well, I would look at the relationship between banks and cryptocurrencies to get an idea about how banks are likely to operate a propaganda war. But I think that banks on the whole haven't felt very threatened by cryptocurrencies. There was some maybe unnecessarily negative or scary propaganda at the start of Bitcoin, but then they started to see that it wasn't going to be a threat to their business model, and it hasn't been so far. And looking at what Bitcoin could become, it's not a payment system.
No, it's a speculation system, isn't it, really?
So the kinds of attacks that I would expect for a system like this, and I'm not an expert, would be propaganda attacks, like negative reviews, false stories, scare stories, emphasizing things that have gone wrong in the press.
So if there's no sort of center to if it's a completely sort of network distributed system, there's no real center to attack, is there?
Well, that's why a lot of people are very bullish about distributed systems. I'm not bullish about distributed systems in an evangelical way, but I do think we need to be balanced and apply judgment on a case-by-case basis about what things and what aspects of things should be distributed and what things centralized. Because we find, in many ways, centralized infrastructures are much more efficient. And we shouldn't throw that baby out with the bathwater.
Anything else you want to say in the book? Any articles you've written or any other introductory information anywhere that people could read about this? Maybe with links to more in-depth info if people want to go there?
Yes, I've written a nice article recently on the creditcommons.net. It's a blog post there called The Mutual Credit Society.
I'll link to that in the description.
And that'll do for now.
Is there anything else that I've missed in this interview that you think is essential for the book that you can think of?
Well, I know how to contact you when I think of it.
Yes, okay. All right, then. Thanks, Matthew. Any questions anybody has for Matthew, please post them on the blog or on YouTube. They'll probably have a better chance of being answered on the blog. And I'll maybe reblog that article as well. Yeah, this is the second in the series. If you want to follow the series, subscribe to the blog and or the YouTube channel.
Not to mention the podcast.
Not to mention the podcast. All right. Thanks ever so much, then, Matthew.
Cheers, Dave.
Bye.